evening. It is a wonderful privilege and an honor to welcome you here tonight at the first historic Plaatjies Van Huffel Memorial Lecture. As a Faculty of Theology here at Stellenbosch University and myself as the Dean, we are privileged and we are honored to honor a colleague, an ecumenical church leader, as well as an activist against gender-based violence, against racism and against classism. We want to welcome all our ecumenical guests, our ecumenical church partners. We want to welcome all our academics, colleagues from other parts of our university. We also want to welcome our students, and in particular, the postgraduate students also of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel. We want to also welcome in particular the family and friends of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel, Reverend David Van Huffel, and the sisters of the late Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel. A few months ago, before the lockdown was announced by our South African government, and in Wellington, we were talking about, and myself and Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel and her sister was talking about this day. And we were planning how her historic inaugural lecture would take place. We also experienced that there is an excitement within the church community, within the academic community for this evening and for this event. Things, however, turned out differently. However, we will continue to celebrate her achievements. We will continue to be challenged by her work. And we will also continue to engage and dialogue with the insights as well as the contributions made by Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel. Dear friends and family, dear colleagues, welcome tonight, and let us honor a colleague as we reflect on her legacy. We are privileged tonight to have as speaker the first promoter of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel, Professor Christina Landman. And allow me to welcome Professor Landman. Allow me to also express our sincere appreciation for her willingness to also share the first Plaatjies Van Huffel annual memorial lecture. Professor Landman and Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel, they have served together in academia, in particular in the Church History Society, and together they are groundbreakers, pioneers in a new way of not just doing theology, but also in a new mode of leadership within church. Professor Landman, we welcome you. And now to all the colleagues who are present here, all the students, all the family and friends of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel, we welcome you, and we are of the firm belief that her legacy will continue, that her legacy will continue to challenge, to change structures, and she will continue to inspire us.
Mr. Dean, Prof. Reginald, staff, students and alumni of the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch University, church partners of the faculty and university, ministers of religion of various churches, speaker of this evening, so appropriately, Prof. Christina Landman, Dominee David Van Huffel, familie, vriende van Prof. Plaatjies Van Huffel, all protocol observed. 12 August 2020. This is the day that was reserved for the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel. I want to thank and congratulate Prof. Reginald and the Faculty of Theology for instituting the annual honorary Plaatjies Van Huffel lecture. This lecture appropriately commemorates and celebrates Prof. Plaatjies Van Huffel as academic, at Stellenbosch University. Prof. Plaatjies Van Huffel simply loved academic work. I was chaplain at the University of the Western Cape during her final years as theology student. She completed her studies with excellent grades. With her academic equipment, she started to serve as pastor. She continued with postgraduate studies while she was in the congregation and while she had to travel weekly from Robertson to be with her husband, who was pastor in Scottsdene congregation in Cape Town. Yet, she pursued with postgraduate studies and in the end completed 2 doctoral degrees, one under supervision of Prof. Christina Landman. Years ago, the late Prof. Steve de Grucci and I, together with Prof. Sietske Strybos and other Dutch partners, launched a research project with the title From Our Side. Northern and Southern Christians share their views on the role of churches in public life, and specifically in socio-economic development and transformation. We identified people who were engaged in such initiatives as full-time academics and as practitioners who reflected scientifically on their practices. We identified and invited Mary. She responded to my phone call with no hesitation at all, but with spontaneous enthusiasm. And this pastor of Robertson Oos congregation delivered. The eventual book was launched in South Africa, in London, and in the Netherlands, and the writers were there to present it. While I was dean, Mary was appointed as senior lecturer in the Faculty of Theology. She was later promoted to associate professor. I still remember how the vice rector for research, Prof. Eugene Kloete, remarked at that meeting of the Appointments Committee of Senate that it would not be long before Mary would be in a position to be considered as full professor. And yes, under the deanship of Prof. Reginel, she became full professor. As full professor, she embodies the excellence that a university like Stellenbosch University would like to see in our full professors. Excellence in learning and teaching, in research and innovation, in transformative social impact, in sound academic administration. All of this in local and international contexts. As a professor in theology, she embodies the 7 Christian virtues, namely faith, hope, love, wisdom, moderation, fortitude, and justice. Yes, full Professor Mary N. Plaatjies Van Huffel was nurtured by the contents of her faith, namely the triune God and those who belong to God. She was nurtured by realistic, resilient, and responsive hope. She was nurtured by the excellence of love. She was nurtured by wisdom, sensitive intuition, sound judgment, careful discernment. She was nurtured by moderation and temperance. She was nurtured by the fortitude and courage to make an unfamous decision and to implement it. She was nurtured by justice as both forensic, legal justice, mishpat, and as compassionate, sacrificial justice, tzedakah. Toe Prof Edna van Harte professor geword het by Stellenbosch, het Prof Russell Botman haar gebel om die goeie nuus mee te deel. Hy het toe gesê, "Ai Edna, wat sou jou ma gesê het as sy nog gelewe het? Ai Mary, wat sou jou mamma en pappa gesê het? Wie weet, miskien update jy hulle baie lekker daarbo. Thank you, Mr. Dean."
Goeiedag almal, ek is Walter Philander, predikant van VGK gemeente Bekendberg. Binne die werklikheid van COVID-19 met sy verwoestende nalatenskap moet ons lewe voortgaan. Die kerk en die akademiese en wêreldse leierskap het in hierdie tyd van 2020 ook deur 'n pynlike periode gegaan met die afsterwe van wyle professor Plaatjies Van Huffel, toe sy na 'n kort siekbed sterf. Nie net was Plaatjies Van Huffel 'n dominee nie, sy was ook 'n formidable leier wat die kerk op verskeie vlakke as leier verteenwoordig het. Haar leierskapprestasies is wêreldwyd bekend en kan seker opgelees word. Op akademiese vlak was wyle professor Plaatjies Van Huffel nie net 'n professor wat klas gegee het nie. Sy was 'n omgeefprofessor wat die belange van haar studente altyd vooropgestel het. Vele kan seker hiervan getuienis lewer van haar insette in hulle lewens, het sy persoonlik of akademies. Met haar liefde vir die akademie het sy haar studente geïnspireer om altyd die beste te lewer. Wyle professor Plaatjies Van Huffel was ook 'n versoenende figuur wat onverpoos gewerk het vir eenheid, geregtigheid, versoening en vrede. Die eise van die belydenis van Belhaar het vir haar swaar geweeg in haar betrokkenheid by kerklike en teologiese sake. Haar nalatenskap moet op 'n tasbare wyse voortleef, en een van hierdie moontlikhede is die daarstel van 'n studiebeurs vir studente in haar eer. Ek as voorsitter van die Kaaplandse Kuratorium is by monde van Dr. Frederik Maree van die NG Kerk Kuratorium genader om hierdie moontlikheid van die daarstelling van 'n studiebeurs ter ere van wyle professor Plaatjies Van Huffel in die lewe te roep. Hierdie is 'n intensie, en sou dit realiseer, sal dit via die twee kerkgenootskappe en die teologiese fakulteit van Stellenbosch geboorte gee aan die erkenning van wyle professor Plaatjies Van Huffel se bydrae tot die teologiese vorming van studente by die fakulteit teologie te Stellenbosch. Dit is my gebed en my hoop dat hierdie edele intensie verwesenlik sal word en sodoende studente en voornemende studente inspireer om teologie te studeer. Ek dank u.
Now, colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the speaker of the historic first Mary Ann Plaatjies Van Huffel Memorial Lecture, Professor Christina Landman. Professor Landman is a professor at the University of South Africa, UNISA, and a research director in the Research Institute for Religion and Theology. Now, when Professor Landman was appointed as Associate Professor in 1991, she was the first woman to be appointed as Professor in Theology in South Africa. She is an NRF-rated scholar. Professor Landman is also a minister of the Word in the Uniting Reformed Church and currently serves on the Moderamin of the General Synod as the Actuarius. She was, with Prof. Plaatjies Van Huffel, the only women to serve on the Moderamin of the General Synod of this church. She also serves on the Executive Committee of the Oral History Society of Southern Africa. Professor Landman serves on the committee that advised the President on national orders. Professor Landman is also the promoter of the first doctorate of Professor Plaatjies Van Huffel. It gives me great pleasure to introduce her, and she will tonight speak on the life and the legacy of Professor Mary Ann Plaatjies Van Huffel.
Good evening. In the old days I would have greeted you with ladies and gentlemen, but thank God we are not doing that anymore. That is, we do not address an audience in terms of their gender. And also we prefer not to refer to women as ladies, since lady is a colonial term. A lady is a British woman of leisure, and that is of course not what we African women are. Tonight we honour a very special African woman, Mary Plaatjies Van Huffel, on the night that she was to give her inaugural lecture as the first black woman to become a full professor in theology at the University of Stellenbosch. The first high point in her academic career was when she submitted her first doctorate in 2003. It was written in Afrikaans, but in English the title would have been Women in the Theological Anthropology of the Afrikaans Reformed Tradition. Now, I want to focus on this thesis in this paper, because I think what she did there was groundbreaking, but ignored. That women still today don't internalize the concepts with which she has worked, and that the church has not heard what she has to say almost 20 years ago. Let me first bring under your attention the times in which she presented this thesis in 2003. In the first place, it was very rare for women to submit doctorates in theology in those times. She was actually the very first woman to receive a doctorate in what could be traced back to the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And I think she was one of the first in the Dutch Reformed family. Secondly, and that's very important, is it was not rare but unheard of that somebody could write a thesis in theology on women's studies. Because during those times, women's studies were not an academic subject or a theme. It was not considered to be academic. It was considered to be, in Afrikaans, taaltjies uit suburbia, and that cannot actually be studied and written about in a thesis, in a doctoral thesis at a university. I myself wrote my thesis in 1987, and it was on church policy and on the relationship between church and state. I did not write on a woman's topic. Marie Henriquin also submitted a doctorate on Lumen Gentium, a Catholic document. And even Jolande Dreyer, who submitted her doctorate in 2000, did not write on women's issues, although in 1997 she wrote a book on the relationship between men and women. But in 2000, when she submitted her thesis, it was on the titles that were used for Jesus in the New Testament. So you see, women's studies were not considered to be an academic endeavor. It was Denise Ackerman, of course, who in 1990 wrote the first feminist or women's study doctorate on liberating feminist practices. And there, in 2003, came Mary Plaatjies, and she wrote on women and theology in the Afrikaans Reformed tradition. Indeed, groundbreaking. Let me tell you a third thing about those times when she submitted her thesis, is that race had priority, and one can understand that, but women's issues were not really on the table. Even, you remember during the Rustenburg conference in 1990, the consultation in 1990, the women asked for time to speak, and the meeting was very, very angry and annoyed by the fact that the women wanted to speak, because they said they were busy with urgent things and now the women come with their own little agendas there. And I remember that I spoke to Nico Smit afterwards, and he said to me, the women came and they wasted our time there. And I said to him, these are the women's issues. And we had a long talk. And really he turned on that issue. He turned on that issue. And for the first time, because he listened to a woman's voice, he thought that, yeah, women's business, it should be the core business of the church. And my dearly beloved David Bosch, who influenced my life profoundly, the last conversation I had with him when he died in 1992 in a car accident, was that he called feminist theology a fad. And although he had a massive influence on me, always tried to help me as a young lecturer to go to relevant meetings on racial issues, he never acknowledged that women should have that type of voice. But so race had priority, and not even Alan Boesak wrote on women. I think his first book on with women Bible studies was in 2005, Die Vlucht van Gods Verbeelding. So in this time came Mary Plaatjies, and she wrote a thesis on women's issues. Then you must also remember in those times, the Afrikaans-speaking women, that is now in the 1990s and the early 2000s and even now, were overdosed with what we call the pink boekjes. It was popular books in Afrikaans, like, daily books in which you read your daily piece about how to be a subordinate woman as God wants you. And so during that time, when that was the popular literature, the main influence on Afrikaans-speaking women, that is when Mary Ann wrote her thesis, during a time when Afrikaans-speaking women's lives were private and pink. Now, during a time also, the view on women were very functional. There were functions in the church, women came into church leadership as deacons and so on, but really not in leadership that really mattered. And in the sixth place, there were, in 2003, hardly any women ordained, let alone in leadership, and especially in her church, the Urksa. And she herself remarked that there were 3 women at the time ordained in the Urksa. She herself was ordained in 1992 in Robertson, the first woman in the then Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And that was 10 years after the Dutch Reformed Mission Church reinstalled women ministers of the Word in 1982. So there were a lap of 10 years after the Synod decided that women can be ordained as ministers before the first minister, who was Mary Ann, was actually ordained. The Dutch Reformed Church was even later. They decided in 1990 to restore women to the office of Minister of the Word, but they only ordained Greta Heymans in 1995, so a period of 5 years before the first woman was ordained after their synod has already decided that they can be. The Nederduits Hervormde Kerk was, of course, first to ordain Jolande Dreyer in 1980. So 20 years after her ordination, Mary Ann became the first woman moderator of Urksa. And to date, now almost 30 years after her ordination, there were only 2 women chosen to the General Synod leadership in the Urksa, and I don't know if there are soon to be others. 7, there were hardly any women role models. There were very few women teaching theology at the time in 2003. From the Afrikaans Reformed tradition, there was myself at UNISA in church history and polity from 1980. I taught there. Jolande Dreyer taught from 2000 at Tikkies, Elna Maton from 2000 at Stellenbosch. So, and the last 2 were then from New Testament, which was not the interest of Mary Ann, and I then became her promoter. And I must say, choosing a woman as a promoter for a thesis was itself a brave decision. People were very scared and actually very hesitant to study under a woman promoter. But she made a a very, very strong decision that she wants to study with a woman. Okay. Now, during this time, when women's studies was not an academic topic, there were no women in leadership in the church, there were hardly any teaching at universities, Mary Ann Plaatjies wrote her thesis. And she came and she could have changed it all. She tried to change all the dominant discourses in the church. But the question today is, has she changed it? Was she able to change it? And then the question ultimately is, was she listened to? Now, women in the theological anthropology of the Afrikaans Reformed tradition was methodologically well-founded. It was not stories from suburbia, it was well-founded. She used post-structuralism, deconstruction, Foucault, to indicate how women in this tradition was held captive from 1924 to 2002 in specific roles in the church, and that they were formed by the language used at synods, and that they could not escape from that. And this thesis was aimed at giving another language for the women to use so that they can free themselves from this situation of language and discourse superiority. Now, let me just point out a few things from this thesis, because when you hear what she said 20 years ago, almost 20 years, in 2003, then you ask, why have we not done what she has said? Where would we have been if we had indeed listened to her? Now, at that time, in Europe and the USA, the main method of doing women's studies was feminist standpoint theory, and that said, that rested on two pillars. The one is essentialism, that men and women are essentially different, and therefore we must now give acknowledgement to the essential difference of women, while previously we have only focused on the essential difference of men. And the second pillar on which it stood was epistemological privilege, which meant that only women can do women's studies. Only they can, from their experience, can they do theology. But Mary Ann actually helped us never to go through that phase of hard feminism, because she, on the one hand, she distanced herself from essentialism, and she distanced herself from epistemological privilege, and to say that men and women should work on a partnership theology in which they find themselves and work together in the church in partnership. I think that was the reason why we actually never went through this phase of hard feminism, in actually not in the Afrikaans tradition, Reformed tradition. Secondly, but on the other hand, so on the one hand, she didn't put this feminist standpoint theory, this hard feminism, in place. But on the other hand, she also did not, tell stories from suburbia. She put a very strong methodology there in which women and men can find partnership in the church. And she established women's studies in South Africa, actually, with Denise Ackerman and others, as an academic enterprise. Now, in the Afrikaans Reformed tradition, there was now women's studies as an academic discipline. The third thing she did is she challenged the dominant discourses about women in the church. But Mary Ann, she didn't, as we say in Afrikaans, as jy iemand aan sy neus pluk, dan slaan sy ore toe. She did it in a way which was very, you could listen to it, but they didn't in any way listen to us. So she challenged those dominant discourses where men spoke on behalf of women, that they sit there and they say, should women be ordained or not? And she established women as agents and not of those who are being being spoken about. The fourth thing she did is she dismantled this male power in the church as not necessarily truly biblical or the truth. Male power, she said, was not neutral, it was self-interest, and it was not, as I say, the truth only because it fell into this male theology. On the contrary, the fifth thing she did was she criticized fundamentalist ways of dealing with the Bible. She said they do not necessarily lead to the truth. And actually, they are not innocent either. And she indicated what enormous negative influence these male discourses had on the lives of women in the church. No, male discourses are not necessarily true, and they are definitely not innocent. In the sixth place, she challenged women to revisit their roles, especially in the way they were stylized in the women's ministries in those times. The women's ministries were very strong, but they stylized women during those times, I hope not today anymore, but they stylized women in a specific way, as the serving one, the one that has to report back to the church council and not taking decisions on their own. And she challenged them. They must revisit their roles and what roles they can play in the church. And then she undermined the church's belief that women's roles were biological and divinely ordained. She really challenged that in the way that only Mary Ann could do. And then finally, she deconstructed all these harmful discourses about Christian women, those we have just mentioned. And she said, on the contrary, you should, the lives, not only the lives, but the histories of women should be deconstructed. And women's lives should be rescoped as that of agency. Not to talk about women, but let women then talk about themselves and explain themselves and describe themselves and rescope themselves as agents in the church, not as people that need to be talked about. Then she also said that this dualistic, patriarchal, androcentric anthropology that we have in the church, that should be shifted to a relational and transformative anthropology, in which everybody's humanity should be acknowledged, independent of race, gender, or class. And that was, for a woman to say that in those times, were really, really advanced. And she also said instead of a Western dualism, which is based on gender, the church should move towards an holistic integration of body and mind. And holistic integration of body and mind. Oh man, if we only listened to her. Also, she says biological essentialism should be replaced with a non-gendered freedom. Then she said universal truths about men and women should be deconstructed. What she actually said, they should be destroyed. And she said women's experience is an important point of departure, but not the only one. And thereby she distanced her from this epistemological privilege of women, saying that only women can write about women. No, she distanced her from that. We, men and women, should work together on the history and the future of the church. Then she said power relationships in the church and society should move to partnership relationships, which are non-dualistic and non-hierarchical. From power relationships to partnership relationships. Power relations to partner relations. I think that was an immensely important thing she said, contribution she made in 2003. She also asked for new and inclusive metaphors for God that should be created, because the way we see God is the way we see ourselves and our relationship, women's relationship with men. And then she said the Bible should be reread, not only to a point, not only to point out the few exceptional women who made it into the Bible, but to expose the patriarchal discourses that feed the main narratives in the Bible. And finally then, in this dissertation, this thesis, she invites the Afrikaans Reformed tradition to restructure itself according to 4 values. And those 4 values are inclusivity, holism, relationality, and transformation. So what she said in 2003 was remarkable. Remember, almost 20 years ago. And it was even more remarkable in the times in which she has said it, as I have just indicated. But we know, most of us know the academic career of Mary Ann Plaatjies in 2010. She joined the University of Stellenbosch Theological Faculty, and now she has been promoted to full professor. But I can actually say that I think her whole academic church leadership career was characterized by these 4 values she pointed out in her 2003 thesis, those of inclusivity, holism, relationality, and transformation. So let's quickly look just at the 4 of them. Inclusivity. That was for me very, very touching when I read it now again. Women's studies for her were not anti-man. It was women's studies. She included everybody, men, all races, all churches. It was extremely inclusivist, or rather inclusive for those days. The second value she put here was holistic. I think later it played out as her being a very strong ecumenical person with strong ecumenical relationships. The third then was value is relational. She didn't wrote a lot about personal relations or the private lives of women and the intimate spaces in which women suffered the most. She chose to write more on church polity, although we must remember that her master's was on criticizing church practices vis-a-vis prostitutes. But she was then, and you must also remember that in those times in which she lived, she was actually forced into shifting identities, as actuarius and of the Cape Synod and moderator of the General Synod. She was really forced into a shifting identity because as actuarius you can't ask a person, how are you? You ask him, did you conform to stipulation 6.3.2 of the church order? So she concentrated on church polity and also gender issues, but she didn't really write much within the modem of private lives become public business, which we have today. Now, our fourth value was that she wanted to be transformational. And to evaluate this, I have to ask 3 questions. 1, was Mary Ann able to explore the dialogical spaces between men and women? As I say, in 2003, in her thesis, she was not confrontational at all. But yes, and therefore she didn't establish a sort of anti-man culture in the church. Thank God, that's not what we want. But I think in her later articles, especially the latest one, she was accusing the church of gender insensitivity, and she became more confrontational. But I also say that, and this is just my personal view, is that I think she was used by men in the church. She became the moderator with the help of men, and actually when she died, I was very saddened that although she died during lockdown, there were men who criticized her heavily and actually also worked her out, who were willing to jump into their cars to go and carry her coffin. And I think she was saddened during her life also by that she felt that she was sometimes used to give a more feminine or a more woman's face to the church, and that she was not really chosen because of her skills, of which she had many, many, many. And she was even accused of classism at some stage, saying people only voted for her because she had 2 doctorates, and that's a type of woman they want there. The second question I want to ask is, was she indeed able to establish a contra-culture in the church? Was she able to establish a contra-culture against patriarchy, hierarchy, fundamentalism, sexism, androcentrism, universalism, all those things she mentioned in her 2003 thesis? In her last essay, or the last one I have, she wrote in this 25 years history of the URCSA. She wrote an article, A History of Gender Insensitivity in URCSA, and there she told her life story in an autoethnographical way. That's a method, if I may humbly say, she learned from me. And there she told her story, and she actually said that the church kept her from being a minister of the word and a moderator of the General Synod and a representative of the church on ecumenical forums in the full sense of the word, because of persistent patriarchy in the church. She said that quite straightforward. In this essay also she wrote that URCSA does have a gender policy, but the church at last is in total oblivion that such a polity exists. And she thus called this gender policy of URCSA a milestone never embraced. And I think that is the tragedy of a story. Every story, as we say in Afrikaans, has heilsgeskiedenis, maar ook onheilsgeskiedenis. And her onheilsgeskiedenis was that the church never embraced the gender policies which they themselves have established. So, was she able to establish a contra-culture in the church? On the contrary, I think she was forced, like all of we, into a shifting identity. That is, on the one hand, you must serve the patriarchal ideals and egos of the church, and on the other hand, you try to slip in a little bit of fighting for the women's leadership. And you always have to shift between these identities, otherwise you are totally discarded. Now, this third question is, was she able to bring healing into the church? Now, this first thesis of 2003, we all know she had 2, but the one we discussed here was a healing document. It was a blueprint for healing between men and women. This too, I'm afraid, was a milestone never embraced. Now, what are the challenges for women in Afrikaans Reformed tradition? Well, at this point in time, the first generation women ministers and theologians are retiring or has died. There is a second generation, but there are also problems with getting women called or elected to leadership positions. The Nederduitse Hervormde Kerk, who ordained women first, Jolanda Dreyer, has 7 full-time women ministers, 19 tent makers, but they have 7 women waiting to be called. Also, they have 2 lecturers at the University of Pretoria. Now, the DRC has, out of 280 licensed and ordained women, 83 full-time women ministers, about a third of the total. 24 are tent makers, and 40 women in this church, may even be more at the time, are waiting for calls. The URCSA has 30 ordained women ministers. 3 of them have already left the church. The Gereformeerde Kerke does not ordain women. Will we have a third generation of women ministers and lecturers in the Afrikaans Reformed tradition? Brothers and sisters, now look at me. I addressed you in gendered terms. It must be in my mind. We are celebrating the life of Mary Ann Plaatjies Van Huffel. I once read a book, it was called The Situation is Hopeless, but is it serious? And she said that in her dissertation of 2003. The situation was hopeless, but she had hope to say that it can't be so serious, we can do something about it. Have we done what she recommended, so scholarly, in her first thesis in 2003? I thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's my privilege to do the thanks this evening at our very first Mary Ann Plaatjies Van Huffel Memorial Lecture. A huge thanks to all of you that have joined us this evening. Firstly, we are very grateful to Prof. Christina Landman as our guest speaker at this first memorial lecture. We know that Prof. Christina was not only Mary's supervisor, but also a good friend for many years and someone who journeyed within the church spaces also over a number of years. So we couldn't think of a better person to do this particular lecture. As a faculty, we would especially like to thank Reverend David Van Huffel and Mary's sisters and extended family for allowing us the opportunity to honor her in this way. Thank you. We will continue to honor her in our work at the faculty. To our ecumenical partners and our Vice Rector of Transformation and Social Impact, Prof. Nico Koopman, your partnership in this event is greatly valued. Our last word of thanks is to our technical team, Dr. Peter Nagel and Fusion Hub, Prof. Dion Foster and Simba Pondani for the design work. Thank you all. Good night.